La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 21, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, we're talking about Candace Owens, somebody you've seen all over mainstream media, Fox News, all of the Zionist, Republican, far-right news channels, and social media as well, who we're describing today as a token for neoconservatism and U.S. imperialism. We'll get into talking about what exactly a token is, what exactly is neoconservatism, and her role in propagating and proselytizing, evangelizing for U.S. imperialism. Shout out to everybody in the chat, Big Teal, to Miriam Mohammed, to Compañero Antonio, to Debra Rodriguez, to all the regulars who are here. And joining us today are two good comrades of mine. First, Erica Caines. Erica is a poet, writer, organizer in Baltimore and the DMV area. She's an organizing committee member of the Anti-War Coalition, of the Black Alliance for Peace, as well as an outreach member of the Black-centered Ujima People's Progress Party. Shout out to Ujima. Shout out to Black Alliance for Peace. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017 as a way to provide Black children with books that represent them. How's it going, Erica?
Peace.
It's good to have you back on, Erica. And also joining us is Comrade Salifu. Am I pronouncing it right? I hope I'm not butchering it. Salifu. My fault. People always butcher my name, but it's cool. Ramiro and Salifu. And Comrade Salifu is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the Low Country Action Committee. He's also an editor at Hood Communist. Shout out to Hood Communist. Shout out to Comrade Onyesanu. Me and Comrade Oni did a stream earlier today for AAPRP and Hood Communist. But how's it going, Comrade Salifu?
Peace. What's going on? I'm happy to be here.
That's what's up, and it's good to have you on. And I know you regularly watch and listen to the stream, so it's really great to talk to you. And your comments are always on point, hilarious, politically on point. And so it's good to be talking with both of y'all about Candace Owens. The reason I think it's relevant and important is that as we see the Democrats and the liberals promoting a lot of the seat at the table politics, a lot of the respectability politics, we're seeing a situation where somebody like Candace Owens, she's pointing out some elements of truth in what the Democrats are doing, pandering to Black and brown voters, but she's totally perverting it and bringing it in a right-wing conservative, far-right direction that brings people back to U.S. imperialism, brings people back to empire. And so I wanted to have a conversation about her today. She's actually really popular with a lot of people that I've spoken to, who I went to high school with, who necessarily didn't go to college or who became quote unquote entrepreneurs and are having their own small business or whatever. And it's just interesting because she promotes this idea of like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, no handouts, there's no racism in the US. And unfortunately, it's becoming pretty popular with some sectors, especially like Generation Z, some of the younger kids who have a genuine discontent with the Democrats. I'm sure all three of us here have genuine problems with the Democrats. All of us know that it's bullshit when they're trying to be like, oh, we care about Black and brown people. We understand it's bullshit. But her role is to kind of bring people back into the Republican Party, bring it back in a U.S. imperialist Zionist direction. And so that's kind of the vibe that I get from Candace Owens. And obviously for this show, this program, I like to take a deep dive into some of the spells that we see in mainstream media of how they're trying to deceive our people and try to bring us back to empire. But maybe we could start off with Erica, your initial thoughts about Candace Owens. What has your experience been like? I know you were telling me before we started that you were involved in some protests against her.
Yeah, in the fall of 2019, I want to say September, Trump had came to Baltimore, and the streets were like flooded with protesters and all kind of like anti-Trump propaganda. And then the following week, Candace Owens came, and there was nobody out there. And she pulls up in like a big like roadster, like the roadie buses, like like she's a rock star type of buses. And Ujima and like a few other organizations like PACA, the Pan African Community Action in DC, comrades from PACA, and then some other comrades, all African-centered organizations in that area. We all went down there to sort of like, interject and make noise about what was happening in the city, because at the time, the CBC has like an annual like gala where all the best and finest of the Blacks, they take their seat for like a whole weekend. Yeah. And that was the weekend that she came. So there was a whole like abandonment almost about this sort of critical thing that was happening. Because the way that she came into the arena, first of all, we never seen her. She sneaks in the back, sneaks out the back. She's protected by, and then you see people walk into the arena, and all those people walk in with their regular clothes, and they come out with Black 6 shirts on, like they get a whole package. And it was so interesting that we were actually being confronted by like a few white people, but there was this one Black guy. He had on a tuxedo. First of all, it's the beginning of May. I mean, not the beginning of fall, so it's pretty hot. He has on a tuxedo and a black MAGA hat. He came down from Brooklyn, and it just so happened, I think last year he passed away, and he's like this big, I think his name is Caines. He was like this big Black MAGA supporter in Brooklyn, but he had came down there to support Candace Owens, and he called himself confronting us, like, and basically spilling off her talking points, right? Because what Candace Owens is, she's a far right conservative, and I guess she's a journalist because she's worked for Turning Point USA, right? But she's obviously pro-Trump. She's anti-immigrant. She's anti-Black Lives Matter. But that's the type of rhetoric that's garnered her national attention, because she's had like tactical use of Twitter, of YouTube, of Fox News panels and such, and she's been able to redefine white supremacy as not like a real thing, but like some defeatist attitude that we have.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, it's crazy. That's wild. That
out, sir.
Oh, that's your son. Shout out to your son, by the way.
What's up, Zion?
So get him on the stream too to talk about Candace Owens. But yeah, no, that's crazy. I
He don't got no clothes on. I'm sorry. He's like, oh no, not on camera.
Right. Yeah, it's just crazy to see that, because there's a counterculture. It's weird, right? Because as revolutionaries, as socialists, as anti-imperialists, we constantly have to be studying culture and how the pendulum moves, right? And I've noticed that like the pendulum has shifted against the Democrats. I think more people are aware of the fact that the Democrats are total hacks, that they're total like poverty pimps. They just want to ride the struggles of Black and brown people and bring them back and have them vote. But at the same time, it's like people like Candace Owens, she's trying to fill that void and capitalizing on it and bring people into like MAGA and making the Republican Party cool, which is, I just find like fucking crazy. So it's good that we're talking about this. But Comrade Salifu, your reaction to Candace Owens, like what have you seen people say about her and your reaction to her?
Yeah, I would say that I have had two really different ways of thinking about Candace Owens. So my initial response to seeing Candace Owens is that like this is a clown. Like this is not somebody that like you should take seriously. And like I don't know many people who personally take her seriously. So like for a long time, I looked at Candace Owens from the approach of like this is low hanging fruit. Like I said, like this is a clown. This is not somebody that's even worth like engaging, right? But as I have been able to study more and learn more history with Hood Communists, with Black Alliance for Peace, with All African People Revolutionary Party, you start to learn that Candace Owens is like a representation. She's the natural sort of like she's the natural conclusion of what happens, I think, when Black people in the US fail to see ourselves as African people. And so at Hood Communists, and we follow the tradition, we refer to ourselves as Africans. Like we don't do the Black American thing. We don't do the African American thing. Like we understand ourselves as Africans because when you understand the identification, it helps guide you in the direction that you're supposed to move politically, right? And so Candace Owens is the natural conclusion of what happens when you dabble in that American bullshit too long. Like that's what happens. And that is the exact reason. So as time has gone by, I've gone from looking at her as just like a clown that's low hanging fruit to an example of what happens when you don't understand your position where you are.
Yeah. Can I just say also to your point though, like even when you mentioned like that's the natural conclusion, I think that her appeal is both like manufactured, but it's also organic. It doesn't hurt her brand to take up like celebrities or like mentioning you know, Trump as like a friend. It doesn't hurt her brand. Like none of these things she's doing hurts her brand, because I think that there's a natural attraction to her, but she's totally, I doubt anything about her is genuine, but I think the appeal to her is
right, which is funny and which is weird because again it goes back to that point of like the lack of class consciousness in America, because the people who like follow her up the most, like the people who love talking about like, oh, Candace Owens got a point, or you know, I want to be like Candace, like people who emulate her, the people who respect her, they don't have shit. Like they're working class people who have nothing to show for their allegiances to like this idea of conservatism. When Candace Owens was like damn near a millionaire, like out of college. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like your class positions aren't the same, but you can't see that because you don't have the consciousness.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea, and it's an example of like kind of like what I like to call Stockholm Syndrome, where you fall in love with your oppressor, you fall in love with the person that's colonizing you, and you aspire to be them, and you can never be them. And to a degree, I'll be honest with y'all, like I had that to a degree growing up as well in New York. Like I was born and raised in New York, and I grew up in Jamaica, Queens, and I would have internships and jobs in Manhattan, and I would see wealthier white people with suits and dressed up. And you know, New York, like it's the kind of city where you got to look on point, you have to look good, quote unquote, in order to get into all the spots. And I genuinely was of that mindset. Like I'm gonna cut my hair short, I'm gonna comb it, I'm gonna wear the suits, I'm gonna try to fit in. And I went to NYU for grad school, and I remember going to an event one time that really opened my eyes to seeing how they will never see you as an equal, no matter how hard you try to be them and to emulate them. And it's just eye-opening because I think that's something that Candace Owens, like her Republican and Zionist owners are never going to see her as an equal. They see her as a tool, as a token. And that's kind of like what we're going to be talking about today. Like, what is a token? A token is somebody who a corporate group or a big powerful entity uses to make it seem like an oppressed group is being elevated, being uplifted, being put in a position of power. And so I feel like the equivalent of Candace Owens on the Democratic side is somebody like AOC or like Ilhan Omar or the Squad, women of color who they come from oppressed nationalities, right? And for the case of Candace Owens, she's African, she has African roots, In the case of AOC, she's from Puerto Rico. The squad Ilhan Omar is from Somalia. Rashida Tlaib, Palestine, and I forget the other woman from the squad. But basically, they use oppressed women of color from oppressed nationalities to enter their party, to enter their corporation, give them a false sense of authority and power so that they can use those people, appropriate their people back into the system. It's a way to make people feel like they're part of something when they're really not. At the end of the day, Black African people are being killed and murdered, exploited every day, Latino people, indigenous people. So it's complete performative theater and politics. And that's what we mean when we're saying tokens, right? These tokens are just figureheads or props for US imperialism. And when we talk about neoconservatism is a specific wing within US imperialist system. We know that obviously the Democrats and the Republicans are two heads of the same imperialist snake. Even within the Republicans, you have certain divisions. You have the two main divisions are, broadly speaking, the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives. And the paleoconservatives are people who are more on the libertarian side. They're still racist as fuck. They're still right-wing as fuck. But they don't want wars. They're kind of like the ones who are like Ron Paul. I would say Trump is kind of borderline paleo and neocon, but they're the ones who are more anti-war, not from like an anti-imperialist solidarity perspective, but because they're like, bring our boys home. We don't want to spend more money abroad. Like it all comes from a capitalist mindset. They're very free market, very libertarian. That's the more paleocon wing. And then you have the neocon wing, which are very explicitly pro-interventionist, the Ben Shapiro, Zionist types, the Ted Cruz types, Marco Rubio, the wing that wants war. They want to provoke war with Iran. They want to provoke war with DPRK. They want to expand preemptive strikes against other countries around the world. They love Israel. They tend to be more evangelical, and they love Zionism and Israel. So that's kind of the more neoconservative wing. And that's really the wing that Candace Owens has been backed by. If we look at CPAC, we're going to hear a speech later at the Conservative Political Action Committee, APAC, which is the American Israeli Political Action Committee, Turning Point USA, all of these, the Young Americans for Freedom, all this stuff. These are all neoconservative entities funded by Israel, funded by the weapons industrial complex, the war industrial complex. So there's some really dark forces that are supporting her. It's not like she's just commenting and whatever. Like she's somebody who's being put out, profited and promoted by the imperialist weapons industry, the beast, you know. So it's something that we have to really carefully examine. I want to play a clip from Candace Owens' appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast where she's talking about race in the United States, just totally making it seem like we're past any sort of racism. And then I want to get you guys' reaction because it was just really disgusting to hear.
1,000 years ago to human beings of today, we're moving in a general direction of a much more positive culture.
Right,
and
but it doesn't feel like that.
Does to me.
To me, it does too.
Racism is negative. We both agree, right?
Right, 100%. But it can't be depleted.
But don't you think it can be shunned out of society slowly but surely if people realize there's repercussions for racism?
Repercussions, but then you're operating from a fear. That doesn't mean that you're not racist because you're afraid to say it.
No, but people realize that, you know, it hurts people's feelings. It causes all sorts of issues. And
human beings, especially when they're in, and I've learned this all the time, when they're in a spot where they're fundamentally unhappy, it's very easy for them to lash out.
It is.
And so if you find someone who's just miserable, right, who doesn't, have, I don't know, the career, the girl, whatever it is, that person is much more likely to say something that's vitriolic. And that's the human condition. Like, you're not happy, so you lash out at someone else.
I agree with you. But don't you think that human beings in general are less racist today? Certainly less racist publicly in America than 1950.
Oh my gosh, yes,
right?
no questions asked.
So
America
68 years ago, if we go back 68 years ago, the world has changed for the better today.
100% in terms of like the social progress that we've made, especially in America.
Do you think it's possible that 68 years from now, we could at least come very close to eradicating racism?
That's a very good question. So if you're talking about just America?
Yes. Well, let's just go with America because let's just wrap it up because I don't know what the fuck's going on in China or wherever.
I don't know.
There's some places where racism is just deep.
Yeah, it's
seated,
it's
they
deep seated. It's never going to go away.
Yeah.
So that's why I say like racism
I don't know, never go away
because they change it up because then they'll say Americans are racist towards Muslims, right? When you say that you're going to do the Muslim ban from certain countries, and that's also considered like racism, and not just like, national security, right? So everything sort of becomes racism. So the problem with racism is nobody knows what it means anymore.
So that's her on Joe Rogan's podcast talking nonsense. And I just wanted to pass it over to you, Comrade Erica, your reaction to that. And what does racism mean to you from a revolutionary, socialist, African, internationalist perspective?
Yeah, well, I'd say that's a deep ass, right? I used to be technical, right? About racism is a social construct and all of that. But I think that's critical race theory shit that I'm trying to move away from because I see how that kind of folds into a similarist project. And it's not like I have it's not a debate about critical race theory, but it's just I'm trying to move away from that because I know there's other frameworks that existed before that explains our conditions. But I do think that it is constructed under capitalism. But I do struggle with that chicken or the egg type of thing. What came first? Just based on the colonial projects that have existed. Were they? Some could argue that they were capitalist based. Some could argue that they were racist based that led to a colonialist project. So for me, I'm sort of unpacking what is racism as opposed to I understand clearly what colonialism is. I understand clearly what imperialism is. Racism, I would agree that I think that it changes depending on the functionality of it. So it's really hard to concretely say for me right now what I would consider racism, but I do understand the dynamics of racism in things like the colonial project, in things like capitalism, in things like imperialism. So I think defining it or making it distinguishable that way helps me understand its use and how it propagates in our communities, especially in a police state, which I guess is similar to how anti-Blackness functions, I guess, but also trying to move away from that.
Yeah.
But I have to say with Candace Owens, to her credit, has been effective in exploiting the discontent, right? Because she does a lot of double talk. You would hear her concretely say that racism does not exist, that racism is not a problem. But then that she's won civil cases, racist civil cases when she was a student that's in the tens of thousands of dollars. So, and then here she's arguing, well, I don't even know if it could be eradicated. So she goes through her ebbs and flows of whatever the hell she decides is convenient for her discussion or her talking points. But I do think that what she is good at is manipulating those talking points or exploiting them because she understands that there is a natural discontent, right? She is Black after all. She is an African. So it's not like she does not experience these things. I mean, she could deny it, but I think that her experience with it allows her to play on it. So at least play on the ways that the Democratic Party exploits it, right? So she can draw on the ways that they are able to misuse racism or play on racism or exploit racism to their benefit, which is what they are doing. So that's a benefit to her. But I also think that she does these things with plantation, she talks about plantation or how the Democratic Party is trying to take us back to the plantation. And I think invoking that rhetoric, which is Richard Nixon rhetoric almost, it's savvy, right? Because she understands that that's also how we understand a sort of dichotomy of racism with the slaves and master sort of dichotomy of how we understand our dynamics as Africans here. So she's effective in that way, but I never think she ever knows what the fuck she's talking about.
Yeah, no, and it's crazy because the way she's talking, she's we US. I'm dude, if you were to go to some of the whitest parts of the US and she's talking about we as in the United States, they would reject that. They would be who is this lady? Why are you including yourself in the empire? And it's just crazy because I see that happen with other groups too, with Latinos for Trump and with some other oppressed nationalities where they identify with the empire and they're oh, our country, I'm like, dude, this isn't. First of all, this isn't a nation. Second of all, the people who you're backing and defending will never see you as an equal. And it's just classic Stockholm Syndrome, where you're defending the interests of people who are oppressing you. And it's a really sad thing to see. And she is somebody who is on the face of that. But Comrade Salifu, your response and reaction to her.
Yeah, so something that interesting that stood out to me. Hold on, before I say that, I will say, because I know that there are so many people who, because that was what Joe Rogan's podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that there are so many people who listen to that podcast, and there are so many people who are kind of following in the school of Candace Owens. Something that I've been trying to get better at is help people, not tell people what positions to take, but help people to think about the positions that they're taking. And I think one of the easiest way to point out whether or not you are following along in the school of somebody who has reactionary thoughts and views is back to Erica's point. Pay attention to their consistency on topics, because that's like very important to highlight about Candace on what Erica said about how she flip-flops. Anybody who you hear on one day, you can hear on one day, aligned with somebody who's saying like racism is not that bad, and then the next minute you hear them like obfuscating about what racism is, like that's a person who isn't following a particular ideology. They're not well read. They don't have like a historical context for the things that they're saying. They're just talking, and Candace Owens just be fucking talking. So that's the first point. But the second thing, I'm gonna go in on the response to like racism a little bit, and like Erica, let me know if I'm off base, because I know me and you we talk and try to challenge each other about definitions and stuff like that all the time. But I've noticed that we're at a point now where it's very easy for everybody to talk about racism, right? Like it's this like amorphous sort of undefined thing, and so you can just kind of like talk about it, whether you're a stone cold liberal or like these days a stone cold neocon. Like it's trendy to just talk about racism. But the way that I try to think about racism in the context of the conversation that they were having is a conversation about power. And so Erica brought up just now understanding racism through the construct of like colonialism, right? You have colonialism, which subjugates people. It makes people makes people in service to some other people. It makes some people superior to some other person and other people inferior to those people. And it uses racism as the justification for the thing that it's done. And so for me, I don't find any particular value in hearing two people sit around and talk about, in 68 years, do you believe we can completely eradicate racism? I mean, in 68 years, are y'all trying to eradicate colonialism? Like, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I'm not, now we're having these conversations about racism as like things that are attitudes, when I don't give a fuck about how white people feel about me, like as a Black person. Right. What I'm concerned about is the power to define my own reality, so that no matter what white people think, or you can think I'm a monkey all you want, but if I got the power to get you the fuck out of here, then that's great. We equal. It's fine. I don't give a fuck. You know what I mean? But so yeah, I feel like now we've reached this point where conversations about racism are about feelings, which, even though she takes like very conservative positions, I would argue that conversation that they were just having was like a very like anti-racism liberal ass conversation. So it's just things to pay attention to.
Right. And that's, and to your point, like we do have these conversations like almost practically daily, like just trying to figure out or maneuver the ways that we can like talk around these talking points, because it's like anti-racism is a big sell. And I think like our comrade Josh, he has a great article about that, like how people are able to market anti-racism without actually doing anything. So then that brings us back to like, so what the fuck is racism? Like what are we actually talking about here? Like, so like when I was like, that's a tall act, because it's like, well, how do we define it, right? How are we defining it? Because it really, people are picking and choosing a convenient way to define it that really doesn't challenge, like Salifu was saying, power. And I think that's the ultimate thing that we need to be addressing is power structures, power dynamics. And I think when we get closer to actually discussing full out imperialism and colonialism, then we really understand the dynamics of power and who's subjugated and who has the power and how, you know, how the fuck we get power back or how we gain power.
Yeah, no, well said. I mean, it's totally correct. And Carmen Orlando had a shout out to Orlando. He said, you should do a Neocon token episode on the Latino shows like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz that advocate for war against Venezuela. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because the situation of Latin America is interesting because Latino and Latin American is not a race, right? So you have Afro-Latino indigenous within this colonial construct of Latin America or Latino. And people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio are just white settlers from Spain, you know, who have more Spanish dominant roots in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, and specifically in Cuba as well. And both of their families were counter-revolutionary families, right-wing. They were allied with the counter-revolution against Fidel Castro. They come from a wealthy settler family in Cuba. And so there, the race and class dynamic is like so obvious, right? You have these white Tinos, I call them, white Cuban gusanos, who are advocating for war against Cuba, against Nicaragua, against Venezuela, who are imposing a stranglehold blockade against Cuba, against predominantly Black and brown people on the island. So it's just so like pronounced. And in Latin America, you see that often a lot of times. And you see the same situation, right? Where in media, they'll have Latino tokens, but they tend to be lighter skinned. That's something that happened within the Heights recently, that they use lighter skinned Latinos as tokens for U.S. imperialism. But it's just an interesting conversation. And I want to play this other clip. This is Candace Owens addressing Cardi B, responding to Cardi B. If y'all were following this feud, it was like all over Twitter and WorldStar and all this stuff. Basically, Cardi B and Candace Owens had a back and forth. And Candace Owens here is responding to Cardi B, who had just had a meeting with Joe Biden, U.S. President Joe Biden. And so again, like, this is the false dichotomy, right? It's like Democrat, Republican. And so I want to play this clip and get the reaction from you guys. But let's see what Candace Owens has to say to Cardi B.
Okay, when you stand on a platform and you pretend to care about Black men, when you ask Joe Biden, what are we going to do about these Black men dying? He should have asked you back, what are Black men going to do about Black men dying? Because 94% of Black men are killed by other Black men. Okay, we don't have an issue with police officers. In fact, if you go into those inner cities and you go into those projects, they need more policing. So you're a fraud. If you're sitting here making it seem like you're afraid of police officers. Are you afraid of your husband? You're more likely to be killed by your husband, way more likely to be killed by your husband than you are by a police officer. And you know that, right? You know that Black men kill more white men. You know that police officers are killed by Black men 18 and a half times more, right? So don't use your platform and 75 million people to make it seem like police officers are the issue. You're uneducated. I mean, that is just what it is. You are uneducated. And I don't have a problem, by the way, with musicians and rappers and hip hop artists dabbling in politics if they're sincere. What I mean by that is, are you talking to people on both sides? Are you trying to actually get an informed understanding, or are you just being a mouthpiece for one party? Charlemagne the God has multiple people on his platform. He's talked to Republicans. He's friends with Senator Tim Scott, talks to him. He's a Trump supporter. He's had presidential candidates on his show, on The Breakfast Club. But he asks serious questions. He doesn't sit down with Joe Biden and say, oh, grr. In fact, Joe Biden wasn't comfortable when Charlemagne the God was sitting down and speaking to him, because Charlemagne the God was asking so many difficult questions. He wasn't just giving him a Santa Claus list like you are. I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that, and none of it makes sense. If you're serious about politics, if you're serious about trying to use your platform for good, then you need to educate yourself. That's literally all anybody is saying to you, is that you need to actually educate yourself and do the work.
Crazy stuff from Candace Owens, token for neocons and U.S. imperialism. Erica, your reaction to that?
Well, she just pulled all of those numbers out of her ass, like all of them.
Yeah.
I was just like, okay. And then I just find it like there's something like really dark in a sense. Like, she's married to a white man, and she's telling Cardi, who's married to a black man, that he's most likely to kill you. So there's like, all right, sis, okay. But aside from that, right? So there she's playing back into the racism doesn't exist type of thing, where it's like, oh, we need more policing. And you know what's funny about that is that Cardi thinks we need more policing too.
Yeah, yep,
that's
true.
Over here, like,
so like it's so and to even evoke Charlemagne as someone who's serious, it's just to say because he's friends with Tim Scott. I mean, Charlemagne is someone who is quoted in the beginning of the Breakfast Club, saying that he won't let nothing that God and the white man had in store for him. Like he won't let nobody come in between that, and that's evident in his career. So like to hear that he's friends with Tim Scott is like, well, of course he's friends with Tim Scott. Because he's mixy, he's friends with everyone. He's a social climber and he's petty B, so that's what he's going to do. But I don't think that makes him more serious than Cardi B as someone who's dibbling in politics, because neither one of them are doing anything active for the liberation of their people. Cardi is advocating being a landlord. Right. All over her streets with Birkin bags. It's a clear class allegiance that Cardi has made, despite, her fans being working class. So I don't see Candace and Cardi as opposing point of views. I just think that this is just like, a Twitter beef, and everybody wants to see who could drag one another more. But but Cardi is also pro-police for the same reasons, and primarily because she also has assets to protect. So it doesn't make sense for her to not have police. Yeah, but I just think that whole shit was a mess, and I didn't really know that was a thing.
Yeah,
that was my whole first thing seeing that. I'm like, girl, 94%. 94%.
Right. Yeah, it's just interesting because when that whole feud started happening, I felt like it was designed to keep people within the liberal Republican paradigm, right? It's like, who will win, red pill or blue pill, left or right? And it's like, no, both are bullshit. Like both are not presenting, both are pro-police, like Erica said, both are pro-empire in a certain way, pro-consumerism, capitalism. And it's just a false dichotomy meant to kind of box you in to pick either or, when there is this third path called socialism, internationalism, Pan-Africanism, revolution. But we're caved in by mainstream media to see these only two sides and not see the people on that third side. And that's kind of the vibe that I got. But Comrade Salifu, your reaction to that?
Yeah, no, like the whole time that I was watching it, all I could think about is like one of the biggest things, that the reason why I think this channel is really important is because I feel like you do a really good job at helping people cut through the bullshit and see propaganda for what it is. And so one of the things that I found most difficult, but one of the things that we have to fight really hard to do with our people is to, like, we have to make people aware of how propagandized every single like moment of our lives are here in America. Like, you cannot get away from it, and to such an extent that the average American confuses entertainment for like actual political engagement. So everything that you just said about how that beef was created to keep people within the constructs of blue and red, and like who's going to win, blue good, red bad. When you actually get into the weeds, like if Americans actually cared about facts and like things that were true, and you just took apart everything that Candace Owens just said, like Erica just said, the numbers, she completely pulled those out of her ass. I have no idea where she got those numbers from. When you're talking about Black communities needing to be more policed, as a Black woman who, like, Black women specifically, their encounters with police, overwhelmingly negative. So you're saying this as a Black woman to another Black woman and presenting this as like fact, right? But then on the same side, like Erica just said, on the exact opposite end of many of those points, Cardi would not necessarily disagree with what Candace Owens is saying. So what we are forced to live with here in the United States is always this this battle of optics. So really what it comes down to is the people who are going to ride or die for Candace, they're going to ride for Candace's delivery. They're riding for that idea of, no nonsense, straight to the point. Yes, you need to think about your demands, and yes, she's uneducated because she's a stripper, and then there goes all the respectability stuff that comes in with that. And then on Cardi's side, you have mostly people who ride here for either cult of personality, or because Cardi is regurgitating really well mainstream talking points that people have come to be equated with. Nobody in the conversation is really pushed outside of any comfort zone. There isn't really any real material reality talked about. There's no historical basis. It's just a conversation of optics.
Well said, man. I mean, that's such a great way of putting it. And also shout out to Comrade Deborah and Comrade Leah Boggs. She said 2 sides of the same coin. And that's exactly right. I mean, it's just designed to keep you in that state of seeing only 2 sides, seeing only 2 faces of empire, and not being able to learn about, even in our educational system, we never learn about, at least I never learned about, I went to New York City public school, we never learned about Amilcar Cabral or the African liberation movements, and we're purposely not taught about these things so that we only understand Democrat and Republican. And it's just really crazy to see that. And I think also one of the things that really is important to keep in mind is that both parties are invested in the systemic oppression of African and indigenous peoples around the world. I mean, not to mention under Obama, the fact that he expanded AFRICOM, he droned a bunch of African countries and Middle Eastern countries. And it's something that people really have to be aware of. But I don't know if Comrade Erica, if you have any response to that.
Yeah, and also to the point of the red pill, blue pill example, that's the main reason Ujima went out there, because it's we're not advocating for Democrats either.
Right.
We're not here to represent Democrats. We're out here to show people that there's another option, because those talking points are valid. The Democrats are doing a bunch of bullshit, so it's easy to divert from that. But also, I think that because there were no Democratic presence there to even push back against a Candace Owens, and even in the same way that they would have, or even in a smaller way that they did push back against Trump showing up. That's how you end up with a Kim Classic in Baltimore, who is a Black woman who has a similar politics, if not the same, to Candace Owens, who's running under the Republican ticket. And Maryland itself has a pretty big Black Republican base. And they call themselves, I guess, the Frederick Douglass Party or something like that.
Wow.
Well, because originally Republicans,
right.
Yeah,
right,
but
right.
They are, yeah. So that's why I always when Salifu was saying in the beginning that the first impression was that Candace was a joke. It's she's a very manufactured and a very well, the point I was making about people coming out with those shirts is to say that this is all strategic. This is all very set in place. They know to bring people in regularly. They know to let people leave with gift bags and T-shirts and take pictures and inside, and it's a big to-do inside. But you wouldn't know any of that as you're seeing people walk in. So it's very, very, very put together. So that's why I stress she's both a manufactured appeal and organic. But she absolutely does not know what the fuck she's talking about. She absolutely I really strongly question if she even believes what she's talking about, right? Because if this is your bread and butter at this point, does it matter if you believe it? So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And even on the international front, I mean, she's somebody, again, as I mentioned earlier, she's backed by the CPAC, the APAC, the big Zionists and imperialist lobbies that push for war, the Neocon sector of the U.S. imperialist ruling class. And little by little, as I've been following her, she's been making more comments about international politics. She kind of started off on this Thomas Sowell vibe of we need to get Black America off of welfare, and we need to do this and that. And she's slowly been moving into like that kind of Zionist, the US needs to go and bomb the crap out of every country in the world and this and that. So I want to play a little clip from her speech at CPAC. Again, this is the Conservative Action Political Committee, where she's talking about all this stuff, Iran. So I just want to play a little bit of this, get your reaction and response. This is her. They're staging her at this conference. So let's take a look.
Wow. Hello. Can you guys hear me all the way in the back? Yes. I love you guys too. All right, I'm going to get right into this. So I said to my husband the other day that it's become apparent to me over these last few years that the left has no idea that the world did not begin in 1776. 3 years of traveling the country and facing off with hysterical liberals, and that is my scientific conclusion, that they haven't the slightest idea that anything exists or that anything ever existed outside of the United States of America. And let me give you a recent example. You will all recall when the left, which in my opinion has morphed into a doomsday cult, feverishly and inaccurately predicting that everything President Trump says or does will end America. But you all recall when they once again prophesized our doom when Iranian terrorist Soleimani was slain in a military operation. You remember that, right? This is the beginning of World War III, their headlines read. They promised us we were going to head straight into World War III. It was a remarkable day because it was the day that we watched Democrats and liberals, the ones who have been shrieking about sexism, misogyny, and the need for more feminism, turn into passionate defenders of the state of Iran, the country whose constitution quite literally states that a woman's life is worth half that of a man's, a country where women are punished by law for up to 10 years in prison if they are caught not wearing a veil, suddenly became the apple of the left's eye. Of course, the war never happened, but in the midst of their delirium, a tweet went out from resident anti-American Colin Kaepernick. And the tweet read, exactly, and I quote, "There is nothing new about American attacks against black and brown people for the expansion of American imperialism. America has always sanctioned and besieged black and brown bodies. American militarism is the weapon wielded by American imperialists to enforce its policing and plundering of the non-white world," end quote. Fascinating. A rant about black and brown bodies being imperialized, a word that I must assume Colin either doesn't know the definition or the history of, used in defense of Iran. And so, of course, you know me on Twitter. I felt it necessary to mention to Colin, gently of course, you know me, I'm very nice on Twitter, to mention to Colin that that particular country of brown and black bodies used to be known as Persia. And rather unfortunately for his implied thesis regarding their perpetual victimhood at the hands of white people, Persia used to be an empire, quite literally an imperial dynasty for 200 years, almost as long as America has been alive. It was once the most powerful state in the world, imperializing regions from Egypt to India, regions of, you guessed it, black and brown people.
So that's a clip from her CPAC speech, and I wanted to play some of that because there she's delving more into foreign policy. She's talking shit about Iran. She's regurgitating the Zionist lies about Iran. First of all, Iran has more women PhDs and scientists than most countries in the Middle East. There's a lot of women representation in the Iranian Congress. Women have rights in Iran. Women are part of the Iranian revolution. The vice president, a woman, and it's just complete lies and just celebrating the killing of somebody, Soleimani, who was a hero, who was defeating ISIS, who was standing up to Western imperialism, and she was acting like as if nothing happened, but shit did happen. Like, that's the thing, like, because she's in the US, she didn't see all the killings and devastation that happened to people in Iraq and Iran because of U.S. imperialism, the sanctions. So very dangerous stuff, right? She's going into the neocon Zionist lies about Iran, promoting Israel's foreign policy, the U.S. imperialist foreign policy. But Comrade Erica, your reaction to that?
I just think she's a jackass.
Just straight up.
I'm sitting here like, what can I say? Like,
she's just a piece of crap.
No, because I mean, well, first of all, she doesn't get invited to a lot of these things. So I guess you have to show up and show out, right? Because they really shut her out of a lot of these things, particularly the Republican Party. So I guess when you do get the invite, you really have to like go all out. But I don't know. I just feel like, where do you start? I mean, to even evoke Persia in the context of the current U.S. empire and what it's doing. I mean, the U.S. military the U.S. government has the entire globe split up in military commands, right? So we can't act like that's insignificant. And 40 of those bases surround Iran alone. So we can't act like that's insignificant. But to just brush that off as if she's so knowledgeable in Iran, like she's known all this all along, and here comes Kaepernick.
Right. Yeah.
Just read some quick headline, that's how she's approaching it. Like, she's been well-versed and well-studied in Iran and geopolitics, and this has been a subject that's been dear to her heart because, she just so happily mentioned it to her husband, and who in himself, we don't talk about the husband or not, because Brexit is a play on words from Brexit, which is he's fully a part of. He stirred that right on up. He's a figurehead in that. So a lot of her politics, I feel like, are drawn in or shaped by him potentially, because he's a right-wing freaking neocon. But yeah, it's a lot, and I feel like she's a jackass. Like,
she really is.
I really don't know what else to say, because and also I was cracking up because Leah was in the chat. I seen her saying, like, the hair, and that was really my first thought. Like, oh God, come with this dry hair to talk a whole bunch of nonsense to white people. Like, and it was really, and she enjoys that. Like,
she loves it.
Like that's her time to shine. She enjoys the Twitter spectacles. Like, none of this I don't think is serious to her, and that's why I feel like it makes me upset, because a lot of this is fodder for her. Like, just things to talk about, just things to get involved in. But like, she has no real investment either way.
No, definitely, and you could tell it's really sad. Like, she really basks in white gratification and white glory, and they're like, you're so amazing and you're so beautiful, and it's so weird and obvious. Like, anytime she's in these conservative right-wing spaces where they're like, you're so amazing, and it's like, dude, that's fucking creepy, that's weird. And it's just really sad, because I see that happen a lot with people who, among our colonized, oppressed Black, brown, indigenous people, there are sectors of our people who really still fall for the lies of the colonizer, of the empire, that we can be just like them, that we can assimilate to them, that we can dress and act like them and talk like them, but we'll never be that, and it's just really sad to see her basking in that. And I mean, her comparison of, like, her bringing up the Persian Empire, first of all, that was like fucking 4,000 years ago, right? How are you going to compare like an empire 4,000 years ago to today? And I think, Erica, just like you said, like, that's such a great point. The US literally has carved up the entire world into a giant military base where they're like, this is our Southern division, our African division, our Asian division. They have bases, over 800 military bases around the world. How many bases does Iran have? Like, none, and to compare it is just really disgusting. And it's just interesting as well, because it falls in line with the Zionists, the Israeli talking points that always target Iran, never Saudi Arabia, by the way. You never hear them talking shit about Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia has all the oil. They work with the big oil companies. the big imperialist companies in the US and the UK. They never talk about Saudi Arabia, right? But Iran is always the problem for some reason, the country that has been at the forefront of resistance against the empire in the region. So I just found that really fascinating. But Comrade Salifu, your reaction to her CPAC speech.
All right, so you know how we was talking about racism earlier? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the double speak of Candace Owens and a lot of conservatives. Because when she comes out in the beginning of the speech, she's just like, liberals and Democrats don't know any history. They don't know anything about the world before 1776. And when she says that, that is true. They don't. Or either they do, but they don't engage in the same way that Republicans don't either, right? But notice how in her response, that whole rant that she went on about, she read Colin Kaepernick's tweet, then she brings up Persia. That referencing of Persia is an example of racism, because she doesn't deny that the US is doing these fucked up things in these places. She doesn't deny imperialism. She doesn't deny anything in Colin Kaepernick's tweet. She brings up Persia to justify what they do, right? So it's like, I can make this really bad history. I can dabble in bad history to justify somehow US imperialism, which is really dangerous, but it's also just like fucking racist. But this is what an interesting sort of I would say comparison between conservatives and Democrats is that conservatives do things like that, and then Democrats do their other thing, which is just flat out like lies and like denial. Then they like stage like coups, they like hire mercenaries, they like do all the things that make them really successful at imperialism. But then Republicans just do dumb shit like that. Like that is the basis of like the Joe Rogan podcast. That's the basis of all conservative media. Let's just make a myth and just like say it really loud and like really confidently, and it's just gonna like catch on. So I was just like really as disgusted as I was, because I've never seen that clip, by the way, but as disgusted as I was by the whole Persia thing, I was really interested in it. Erica, you hit the nail dead on the head. Like, you want to talk about, like, you're gonna bring Persia out. Like, what are we gonna talk about next? Like the fucking Ming Dynasty. You know what I mean? Like, Americans, conservative or liberal, neither one of them want to confront the fact that what European colonization was something unlike anything ever seen in the history of the world. They took advantage of a situation and did not stop. Like, they took that shit to like the next level. You're never going to be able to do that comparison sort of thing. So I'll end by saying, as much as she opened by saying liberals don't know any history beyond 1776, none of them know any contemporary history, like, period. They don't know anything about the country that they live in contemporarily. So that's why they play in these myths and these like bad takes on history.
Yeah. But then also, when you keep saying 1776, I think that that's very interesting that she said that date, because, you know, the Republicans had their own 1776 project to combat the 1619 project. So for her to like keep driving that point home, I think that wasn't like insignificant either.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, Dr. Gerald Horne has a very interesting book about 1776 as a counter-revolution. I suggest you all check it out. His stuff is really good.
He's the people's historian.
The people's historian, man. I have mad respect for Dr. Horne. His books, I can read his books for hours. I mean, his content is so on point, and his history of white colonizers in the United States and their promotion of slavery, them wanting to impose and further subjugate African people to this white Euro domination is really important to learn about and to know, because a lot of the Republican types, they act like, you know, the US was all about equality and we're against tyranny, liberty and freedom, but it's like, freedom for whom, you know, liberty for whom? And it's something that his works do a really great job at debunking a lot of those myths. But kind of wrapping up here, maybe we can go start with you, Comrade Erica. As we move out of this liberal, Republican, Democrat, conservative binary, and we want to point people in a revolutionary direction, not just when it comes to race, but when it comes to class, to anti-imperialism, who are some people that have helped radicalize you, some writings or speeches, and what would you suggest people do in terms of like learning more outside of that binary?
Yeah. So I think we talked about this in like a Hood Communist Telegram PE, right? I think we talked about things that have radicalized us recently. And I was saying that I can't really pinpoint one thing, right? Because I think that it's all a journey for me. I can talk about where it started, but I don't think like I was activated until I joined BAP and subsequently joined Ujima to make, to do local efforts because it put my my righteous anger in a place where it could be, activated and active, and I'm not just, subjugated to just, tweeting. Right. I'm actually doing things or actually participating in, liberating our people in any sort of way I can. But as far as books, like I am like a lot of that I read a lot. But I can say a lot of the books that opened my eyes, one of the first books was Assata's autobiography. And I received that the same year that Trayvon Martin had passed. And I was very much a liberal, like very straight up and down, like you can't complain if you don't vote. Like that was very much me.
Wow, I can't imagine that.
Reading Assata saying that a liberal was the most useless word in the dictionary. And I was like,
facts.
and like that has always stuck with me. Because it pushed me to try to understand like why would someone say that? Like what would make, because for me it was effective, right? As a liberal, as somebody who was invested in voting, as somebody who was invested in that structure. Because I understood it, like the politics was always my bag, like, so I felt like, well, what would drive somebody to say that? And just from like reading Assata, that just set off a trajectory of like the deep diving into anything that the Panthers wrote. So that went into Huey, that went into Caesar Times. I read Elaine. And so then from there, just started opening my eyes to there are other paths. And also, there's a lot of the shit that they're saying in 1969 and 1972 is exactly what was happening in 2014, 2015. So that is what radicalized me. Just being able to like push through the idea of what is liberalism and what is it supposed to be, and is that shit effective? Yeah. And questioning that kind of drove me to like, no, that's the answer. It's not. And Democratic Party is a party of pity. And that's what makes Candace Owens effective, right? Because they're able to say, like, they really don't do shit. They're really not doing anything. We're not going to do anything either, but they really aren't doing anything. So,
yeah, most definitely. And shout out to Orlando. He said, no shame. I think most of us here were your stereotypical liberal to some degree back in the day. Hell yeah. I was like, super invested into that. I was all about mixing. I was all about like communism is too extreme. We need to balance capitalism and socialism. And I was all about like dressing up, and we have to polish ourselves. And looking back, it's cool to see that evolution, and it's cool to hear, Erica, your transformation. I mean, you're somebody who has been providing a revolutionary analysis for many years now. And in a short period of time, because 2014 is not that long ago, if we really think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. And Comrade Salifu, your suggestions for people who want to get out of that binary, the left, right, Republican, Democrat, the red pill, blue pill, Coke, Pepsi, what are some readings or speeches that you would suggest that have helped radicalize you? And tell us a little bit about, because this is your first time on the podcast, like tell us a little bit about your journey as well.
Yeah, I definitely was gonna jump out the gate and be like, Erica, you're not the only person. Ramiro, you're not the only person. I used to make Obama memes. Like I used to like the tan suit. That was my favorite thing. Like, oh, they mad because he fly in the suit. Da 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 da. Like now I look back on it and it's so cringe. But I would say for me, I started feeling some type of way about the world. I would say when right around the 2016 election. That was like my first time being a young Black person on the internet. And what really threw me was I was being exposed to all these like young Black activists and like radicals who simply wanted to ask Hillary Clinton questions. Like they just wanted to like ask questions. They weren't even like necessarily saying don't vote. They just wanted to ask hard questions. And I remember spending a year on the internet, like being called like an ungrateful Black bitch. People posting pictures, like this is when people would like post pictures of like hung and burned Black people and be like, this is why you're supposed to vote. People die for your right to vote. And that shit just rubbed me the wrong way. It made me feel so many different type of ways, because what it did was it took like my personhood from me. It like took my autonomy from me. I didn't like that feeling. And that was when that's how I met Erica on Twitter. And Erica at the time was the most radical voice I had ever seen. I had never seen nobody like get on the internet and be like, fuck the Democrats. I had never seen no shit like that. So I was like just like observing and like being really interested in that. But like as far as like reading and understanding the world, Asada is like the groundbreaking text. If you are a Black or a brown person and you feel like everything we just said on this thing is like bullshit, we don't know what the fuck we're talking about, bro, just fuck me, just go read Asada. You know what I mean? Like, just go read Asada. I would say also another reading that was really fundamental for me was it's called Die. Die Inward Die. I don't want your video to get taken down or whatever. It's called Die Inward Die by Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rat Brown. And what that book did for me was gave me a historical perspective on the fact that like inside the United States, Black people did not die for no fucking right to vote. We did not die to be used as, you know, tools of the Democratic Party or pawns for liberalism. Even at the beginning of the fight for the right to vote, there were African people in this country who were actively, keenly aware that the right to vote didn't mean anything if you could not change the power structures around it. They were under no delusions that project of voting rights. And to hear that from somebody who lived it and transformed their thinking for over time was like really like pivotal, I would say, for me. And then the other thing I want to add is that like don't read in isolation. Erica mentioned like joining the organization as like a way to get activated, moving from being radicalized to being activated. Like if you're gonna read Asada or you're gonna read Jamil Al-Amin, like get like 2 or 3 other people together and like read it and like bounce ideas off of each other and like talk about it, because that is how you like actually grow through reading.
Right. And then I seen like some people were saying, Salifu, I don't believe it. But like a lot of when you were talking, I don't know if you were watching, but I was just staring at you so lovingly because I have seen the growth, and that is a product of organization, like, and then, you know, and collectivism. And we really, really struggle with each other daily. Like we really push each other to think outside of these concepts, and how do we push these concepts forward, and how can we break through these concepts and penetrate. And I was just like so proud watching you when you were talking about racism and stuff. I'm like, listen to this African breaking it down. So yes, like I'm deeply, deeply proud of you. But also I say that to say that like you are a direct product of what organizations bring, because it advances like your ability to think critically and to think collectively.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's about. Everything, it comes down to a dialectic process. That's why Marxism is about, and revolutionary politics and socialism is all about practice, right? You learn theory from practice, and being in movements, being in organizations, being in revolutionary uprisings, that's where you can garner revolutionary theory. as Lenin himself said it, right? There is no revolutionary theory without revolutionary practice. And people like Asada, people like Huey Newton, I think, in my opinion, is one of the most brilliant communists, underrated communists of the 20th century. His works, his ability to talk to the people, to the masses, to anybody, and formulate very complicated concepts of Marxism to the everyday person and make it accessible and tangible. That's really what it's about, right? Because there's a lot of people in the academic left who try to use these big ass words and write 1,000-page manifestos. And it's like, it's all about how do you condense it and make it accessible for the masses. And another person who helped radicalize me as well was Maurice Bishop. Maurice Bishop is somebody who I have mad respect for, brilliant, just a smooth, cool as fuck person that I wish I could have met, you know?
Agreed. That's when I like officially was like, yeah, I'm a Marxist Leninist. Like after reading Bishop Speaks, I was like, yeah, I fucks with it. I'll do it.
Yeah. Speaking on the Maurice Bishop tip, one more thing I wanted to add is that if you are African, born and raised in the U.S., you have to read African people outside of the United States, because then what that does is it gives you a real perspective on imperialism and how neo-colonialism works, because that is something that is very difficult for Africans in the U.S. to wrap our heads around, because we don't have land as like a basis to understand how power works. But when you read African people in the Caribbean, on the continent of Africa, talk about how, we broke our chains and then they came right back, but in the form of people who look like us, in the form of people who talk like us. How did that happen? They have that understanding. It's already there. It's analyzed. All you got to do is go get it and apply it to the conditions in your city, in your state, and here in the United States.
Yeah, and thinking about that, somebody who came to mind as well, Thomas Sankara, who from Burkina Faso, his great quote, "Whoever feeds you controls you." And that quote, I always think about living in, like, I'm out here in LA now. I'm born and raised in New York, but I live out here in LA. And out here, like in the hoods of LA, I live in East LA. And then if you go to South Central, it's all fast food chains. It's all processed junk, poison, liquor stores, cigarettes, all stuff designed to keep us poisoned, sick, and unhealthy. No fresh food, no organic food. And I think about that because one of the first projects that he undertook in Burkina Faso was to bring healthy, delicious food to the masses, because he understood very well that whoever feeds you controls you. If we're dependent on these imperialist food companies to nourish ourselves, we're going to be fucked. And we see that happening. The biggest killer of Black and brown people in the United States, one of them, obviously, aside from other things, are heart disease, all these diabetes, all these problems that are, in my opinion, products of capitalism, products of poverty, imposed poverty. And so it's cool to talk with you, comrades. It's been a real pleasure talking about Candace Owens, about the bullshit Republicans and the liberals. And I love having both of you on. We definitely got to have you both on more often. We spoke with Comrade Erica Caines, poet, writer, organizer in Baltimore, DMV area. She's an organizing committee member of the Anti-War Coalition, Black Alliance for Peace. Shout out to BAP. I'm a Black Alliance for Peace member. Please support their work. They do amazing work. Also, the Ujima People's Progress Party. Shout out to Ujima. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017. And Comrade Salifu, member of Black Alliance for Peace and the Low Country Action Committee, and Hood Communist. Shout out to Hood Communist. I love all the organizations that y'all are part of. Great speaking with you, comrades, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Peace out.
Peace.